2 years ago at Spring Quarterly, Oklahoma and Arkansas discerned that the theme for yearly meetings for last year and this year would be loving in the light, Quaker engagement in time of crisis. And I think we've earned being called prophetic with regard to using the word crisis for this year and last year, given that that was done in 2019. As I use the word crisis, for me, the understanding I have is it's a two-part concept, a time of both, and equally so, danger and opportunity. And the way we're saying it for the title of this session is An Ocean of Light and Love Overcomes an Ocean of Pain, Loss, and Death. And this has definitely been the case for the last year and to a great extent the last 4 years. Oftentimes when people speak, they talk about in this moment. And for me, it's more appropriate to think of it as in this season, or as Eileen said Tuesday, in these times. I'm going to do a review of an article in Politico. Serene Jones, who's the president of Union Theological Seminary, was interviewed, and she made several points about in these times that I found to be valuable, and our planning group had enough agreement for that to be what we're going to be using as our basis for discussing the theme of yearly meeting. The title of the article was, "You Need to Take the Religious Left Seriously This Time." And I don't call ourselves the religious left because oftentimes on issues I'm working across the aisle. Like if we're seeking to end the death penalty, we're working very closely with Catholics, and they don't uniformly label themselves as the left. So I would say that it's a faith-based movement that is spiritual, but it's broader than just the religious left. Reverend Dr. Jones might take offense with that, but it's just us tonight. So I'll start with the review. For generations, Christian conservatives have been the face of religion in politics, specifically white evangelicals.
Yeah.
A rising religious left has been rare, even fleeting. At this moment, we see a genuine difference. Houses of worship are showing up to Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Political leaders whose faith is a core component of their identities have gained majority support. Think Senator Warnock, President Biden. The scientists tell us that in 2018 and 2019, 41% of liberal congregations lobbied or marched about immigration. A few years earlier, in 2012, it was only 5%. So with regard to a faith-based movement, we're 8 times stronger than the recent past. The same could be said with greater emphasis for racial justice, that the percentage of folks showing up, standing up, acting up is 8 times more than 2012. We recognize the potential for this movement to remake American politics, the way we think about big questions of fairness, justice, and what Americans owe to one another. Reverend Dr. Jones says, because of the pandemic, people are more open to spirituality in general. And I can echo and endorse that. I go for a walking meditation every night, and I get calls from friends and they say, I'm prepared for the pandemic in every way, but spiritually, let's talk. Reverend Dr. Jones says, and I think that the public eye has been more responsive to seeing the religious left because they need to see them to have any hope at all. There are deep roots in an activist religious left, the abolition movement, and again, I would say the compassionate faith-based movement, the Underground Railroad that accompanied the abolitionist movement. Reverend Dr. Jones talks about the establishment of the hospitals serving the poor. Just short of 40 years ago, some of us, including myself, was involved in the sanctuary movement, transporting of refugees from border communities to population centers where they would be safer and less likely to be found and deported to their death. 40 years ago, we dealt with movements going by the names of Witness to War, Witness for Peace. But overall, liberal Christians have been relatively silent about their faith and how it informs their political beliefs. Now that America is grappling with the coronavirus pandemic, yawning economic disparities appear, yawning disparities of access to healthcare appear. We're dealing with the legacies of racism. Even since this article was written 5 weeks ago, we're dealing with more and more of the danger of voter suppression and the opportunity for enhanced voter turnout, voter registration, enthusiasm of voters. Reverend Dr. Jones talks about bringing the focus to universal basic income. Again, in recent weeks, we've dealt with the 1.9 trillion relief bill that has done more to lift children out of poverty than anything in recent decades. And I see this in our ecumenical organization here in Oklahoma, faith-based groups are moving into doing education and training to combat white supremacy, white privilege. Reverend Dr. Jones deals with a concept that's dealt with by our Quaker author, Parker Palmer, in The Healing of America. Her quote is, "And the more honest one can be about one's brokenness and the sins one has been responsible for, the more freedom one finds for that. Moral and ethical struggles are rising up through the cracks and fissures of this broken moment, of this broken season, in these times. We are at a breaking point. Everything is coming into stark relief. You see it in houses of worship showing up to the fore of the Black Lives Matter movement. Reverend Dr. Jones says, my reckoning in my faith has to do with the reality of the cross. At the center of the story of my faith is a horrific act of violence, and that to have faith is to have the strength to be present to that violence, because you know that God is present in you. My faith gives me the courage and the strength, in fact, the moral demand that I not turn away, but actually move toward the suffering and sins, knowing that ultimately the love of God surrounds all of us, saints and sinners that we are. The love of God is universal. For many Americans, religious belief is secondary, behind party identification. We now are a Democrat who happens to be a Christian. We've seen the erosion of how it was your faith identity that mattered more. Now, Christian as the edge of divine sanction to our political identity. The concept of progressive Christians for Dr. Jones is that we agree on the fundamental equality of human beings, the preciousness of the earth, economic justice, and the baseline conditions of our flourishing. She goes to the scripture, love thy neighbor as thyself, and it's very spot on. We can't love the neighbor and refuse to feed them. We can't love the neighbor and put them in cages. We can't love the neighbor and deny them basic health. A hard question. Did the Trump years change the way you see Christianity in America? The magnitude of a very conservative Christianity that is willing to support hatred. I would add it's so extreme that a strong response is following. Reverend Dr. Jones says, we are at an inflection point politically and socially, and spiritually and morally. We are at a national reckoning over racism in America's past and unfortunately present. Part of the rage is deflecting from taking responsibility for the generational legacies of racism. But also a key component is the failure of the system to address the real economic suffering of impoverished white people. When I gather with my relatives at holidays, after COVID, before COVID, I'm with some impoverished white people that are strong Trump supporters. Reverend Dr. Jones goes on, looking to generational trauma, the fear of pain is actually much greater than the pain itself. The past is shameful and terrible, but telling the truth and coming to grips with it actually is liberating. Traumatic events that stay buried and unspoken cannot be processed. Telling the story of trauma is a necessary, painful step. The more honest one can be about one's brokenness and sins one has been responsible for, the more freedom one finds. For me, it's been key to know that we are to offer forgiveness and seek forgiveness. And my scriptures tell me again and again, 70 times 7. Reverend Dr. Jones says, the history of the United States is not real. Reckoning with its horrors is going to make it more real and show us the path to healing. We are at a time of massive cultural shifts when the world gets reordered. Your imagination with respect to the reality of the divine, transcendent, and who you are gets recomposed. That's a very loaded paragraph. I will say it again. We are at a time of massive cultural shifts. When the world gets reordered, your imagination with respect to the reality of the divine, transcendent, and who you are gets recomposed. We are at an inflection point like the Reformation. We could go the path of more openness, more creativity, more love, more equality, not the hateful, bloody reckoning. And now, as we are ready to begin to form our thoughts regarding discussion, where do the religious progressive goes from here? We will need to deal more with Black Lives Matter, universal basic income, education and training, and more wrestling with white supremacy, white privilege. And we're at a time of a more interreligious reality. I would add just a couple of points that I find valuable and important at this time. And again, since the article was written 5 weeks ago, we're dealing with tragic events that have given rise to African American and Asian American solidarity. I've spent 12 years as an Asian in-law, and within the Asian community, there's been oftentimes the same level of disunity and fragmentation as there is within the Native American community. People from nations don't unite. People from different nations don't unite. People are very diverse and varied, but tragedy has brought a level of solidarity that up till now didn't exist. With the pandemic, I would add that there's been a renewed focus on simple living, self-sufficiency, gardening, less on materialism as a way to occupy your time. And then I would add that in addition to what has been said, that we as Quakers uniquely know what our history and our strengths and our gifts and our talents are. This is a time that hungers for our strengths, truth-telling, sincerity, integrity, humility, simplicity, peace, gentleness, kindness, nonviolence, restorative justice. So as I am about to bring this to a close, I'm going to direct your attention to what I would like you to reflect on as we, as necessary, move to small groups or breakout rooms. Let's reflect about ways in which each of us, as a Quaker, might contribute to a broader movement by sharing about nonviolence, appealing to the better angels of an adversary, by mentoring. In light of this new opportunity of the rise of the spiritual movement for greater fairness, equality, and justice described in the article, what is the nature of loving in the light? The engagement that each of you envision for Quakers, for your meeting, for yourself. Would it be enhanced follow-through on action alerts from your favorite Quaker organization? Mentoring a young Quaker? And I will digress a little bit on that. When I was a young Quaker, Bill Byerly, an old 77-year-old Quaker, invested in mentoring me. He literally took me under his wing. We would sit on the bench at meeting, and he always wore a flannel shirt, and he would put his arm up on the rail of the bench across my shoulders, and he provided me the wisdom of his decades, and it's been such a strength for me. I do lift up mentoring a young Quaker. In addition to that, I would suggest perhaps that Quakers are well suited for providing hospitality, a welcoming spirit to the broader movement. So that is the charge. Tech people, if we can determine approximately the number of people present and divide into 2 to 3 break rooms of approximately 20 each.
20 each and 2 to 3 breakout rooms.
Hey, Kevin, are you doing this?
Do you want me to, or Edwin, do you want to?
You go ahead and do it. Yeah.
Okay, Rex, this is Kevin. There's 33 of us, so I'm going to divide us equally into 2 breakout rooms.
That's ideal.
And is it clear what people are going to do in those breakout rooms? And
yes, and I
clear
will
when
be
they-
in one, and Jan Michael will be in another, and we will initiate the discussion.
Okay, and so you'll tell people when to come back to the theater.
Rex, why don't you set a time now for that discussion and a time for people to come back?
Okay, I would suggest that we come back at approximately 8:45. That's 20 minutes. And while we're out, there will be an expectation of reporting back, so someone could accept that responsibility early, or it could be free-flowing.
So Kevin, are you gonna do it manually?
So I'm going to move 15 people to worship sharing 1, and then the rest to worship sharing 2.
changed the schedule, so we started later. So we've got 20 minutes of breakout rooms. I'll be facilitating one. Jan will be facilitating another one. And then we'll return for a little bit of debriefing.
Is it okay if I sit in?
Oh, yeah.
Is he just having really one person at a time? Because I think I can help on that.
Start from the bottom of the alphabet and put them in worship sharing too.
The bottom of the alphabet?
Craig from upstairs go to your office, and this is his conference room. So it's exercise room.
Somewhere along the way, I learned something about Buddhist thinking, teaching, practice that had to do with acting without being attached to outcome. And I've tried to figure out exactly what that means, what that looks like, how it feels, how to do it, and be consistent somehow. And I came across the word hope-free. It doesn't mean that you are hopeless, but something to do with that attachment to outcome. And I don't know why thinking about being recomposed brings that up, but it does. And I guess I just wanted to finish my thought, such as it was. Thank you.
Well, Pima Chodron deals with that question, and she takes the position that because we have hope, we become weary, disappointed, cynical. And a lot of the Christian authors say that hope is what it is all about. I work as an attorney, and I split out those two concepts. I ask my clients not to be obsessed with expectations, but rather to live in hope. And if they get that distinction, that hope is nothing that we expect, but still we strive for, then when we are falling short of our goals, we're not devastated like we would be if we had expectations that each time we show up, that we would prevail.
That's what I like about the Quaker concept of holding something in the light. It's not having those expectations.
Is Jan Michael back?
Yes, I'm here.
We have a little time to do some reporting back or debriefing. And if the people in your group want to share or if you've condensed some of the themes that were expressed, it's the time for that. If you
Mhm.
are willing to go first, I like that. If you want me to go first, you kick it back my way.
I'll say I haven't taken notes on what people said, but there were several good comments in our small group. I'd hope the people that commented would be able to repeat that here. So go ahead if you have something you want to say at the moment.
So I'll prime the pump. I did take some notes, and there's a variety of themes, threads that were expressed. One that is important is to celebrate the goodness that will bring with it a thought shift. And there's so much that could be celebrated, but it's easy to zoom back to electoral success on January 5th in Georgia, electoral success in November. And what that means is the possibility for legislation to get out of committee and in some instances even become law. There was a focus on part of what we bring to the world around us, to the spiritual faith-based movement, is kindness. And I think that is so important. I echo that. There's a need, particularly for those of us that are in areas where we're small and a very small minority, to work in coalitions. And that is something that we bring a lot to the table each time we show up. There was mention that it seems that if we look back through history, that there's been waves of opportunity and waves of time of pain and loss and death. There was an expression that there's been, particularly now, an awareness over decades of sense of commission and omission. And then I picked up on that whatever it is that is our response, it has to be radical. And my understanding, the word radical means going to the roots of, it's not like mowing the lawn, it's pulling the weeds by the roots. So that's not everything that was said, but it's a fair sampling. And so I'll yield to the other group.
I don't want to pretend to be able to summarize everything that was said in our group, but I will name that there seemed to be a real difference of experience between people who felt in the ideological minority where they lived and people who felt that there was at least a little bubble of people who thought like them nearby. I could hear kind of on the hope scale, kind of a difference along those lines. I made the comment that George Lakey pointed out after Trump's election that the greatest progress in US history had come during times of extreme polarization. And so while Quakers in general, I find, are really uncomfortable with polarization, don't love conflict with their neighbors, you know, over issues, that I've found it encouraging to think about how the last 4 years highlighted issues in a way that did push more people to speak up or take a stand in ways that I can see could bring progress in the long run. And feel like some of that energy is still continuing. And so I find hope in that, but I also really, really heard the difficulty of living in a place where it's hard to see the signs of that.
Thank you. I'll reflect on some of my thoughts as a response to some of the other thoughts that have been expressed. It seems to me that part of what was mentioned in that there's waves of positive, then waves of negative. I like the analogy of the pendulum swings, and regardless of which way it's swinging, we need to put all the weight we have on that part of the pendulum that will move in the direction of our values as soon as possible, and counter the strength of it going in the other direction. One of the things that has been always emblazoned in my being Quaker is there's an aspect of God in every person. We cannot prove that by the scientific method, but when we live that truth, we find abundant examples of its truth. That empowers me to be able to connect across the divide. And sometimes I use language, particularly in Oklahoma, with legislators that are generally Baptist. And I use their language, and I'm probably going to offend everybody still on, but I say to Representative Calvi, we both serve the same risen Christ. And he is speechless. And then he says, then we should be able to connect. And he's, of course, a very conservative legislator that authors anti-immigration bills. But we do connect. And then again, back to the article we digested and the lifting up that all of us that are from a culture of whiteness have been complicit in our silence with regard to the extremes of systemic racism. We're being freed as we, in this past year, are facing our complicity. That's what the theologian said. And that gives us a sense that by being freed, we're liberated, we're empowered, we're strengthened, we're able to go forward and do good. I would ask anyone, but particularly Jan, to give some closing reflections also.
Well, I'm not sure what to say to really add to that. I was thinking, as Rex was talking about there being that of God in everyone, my thinking has developed over the years. And this is kind of the way that I work through thinking about the truth of that. So if we look at Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And even science will kind of echo that in terms of the Big Bang. There was something unknown, that is, there was no creation, there was no universe at one point, and then it's at some instant that developed and became what we have now. So if you think about that in contrast with the Genesis, so in the beginning, there was nothing besides God. And God brought all this into creation. So how did that happen? There wasn't any raw material lying around to make that out of. So the way I envision that is that saying God extended him, her, or itself into materiality, so that what we see as the physical universe is in fact the extension of God from spirit into material. And human beings are part of that too. God extended into human beings. So we're part of God, inseparable. Now, our individual experience is as separate individuals. But if we know the background of it, we can recognize that every other person is also that expression of God in this physical universe for this lifetime participating. And so it's together with all of us that we are part of God, inseparable.
And that thread was present, I think, in what Eileen said last night when she was making some remarks about someone had said there's that of God in everyone. And she, I think, really sort of, without using those words, Jan, picked up on that thread when she put the emphasis on our ability to receive divine messages, to hear God, to be able to reciprocate to the divine. It was a little different emphasis, but I thought that was powerful. And your view, that, not surprisingly, I guess, it ties in very, very closely.
I guess what's important for me in that is realizing that, I mean, I've always said that I guess that the opposite of love is not necessarily hate, or I think it's fear when we look at that from a biological or scientific standpoint. love extends, and it wants to bring in and connect. And you see the love of a mother for its child. And you think of the hormones involved in that type of intimacy and connection and extending that love outward. And then its opposite would be fear, would be the shutting down or fight, flight, or freeze response. And so when we think of those that think differently than ourselves, that are not, that maybe call themselves Christians, but that are politically of a different persuasion, there is that of God that is in them. And so I try to think of when they're reacting out of that place, where am I reacting out of fear? Where are they reacting out of fear? And that reacting out of fear is in a sense, it's a call for love. And so how do we bring about more love? How do we love that neighbor as ourselves? So I guess that's where I find some peace between that dichotomy of being a Quaker and all about finding some sense of quiet peace, inner peace, but also reaching out and extending that love through action in the world.
I think we have the potential for having a clearer sense of the presence of God. That's kind of what Quakers have held on to in terms of our access to God, being able to be taught directly. And as we try to understand God, to become closer to God, I think we can understand God's love for creation, God's love and care for every particle in every moment of time. And with that awareness, then we can look out at others and recognize God's care for them, whatever their fears or suffering may be. And I think that's one way in which God's love channels through us to others.
Friends, I thank everyone. Our allotted time has expired. I feel that there's been a deep richness in this sharing and a genuine investment and participation and willingness to offer ourselves up in a way that is healing and supportive of wholeness and growth. I feel so very grateful. I will settle into silence, but since time has expired, people know what to do. Leave a meeting and have a good night, everybody.